So I'm ready. If well, first of all, my location, I'm down here in the Lehigh Valley. We're just south of Kittatinny Mountain, Blue Mountain. So I'm about as far north as you can be and still be in southeastern Pennsylvania. And we're on the Burke Series soils over Martinsburg Shale bedrock. Interestingly, the Martinsburg Shale down here, where it actually comes to the surface, it was identified by a Welshman by the name of Jones around 1850, and he figured out where they could dig into it and create slate quarries. So our area is called the Slate Belt. At the turn of the century, there were probably 110 slate quarries across the northern part of Northampton and Lehigh counties. And as you go further north, the Martinsburg Shale goes deeper, and it's really, by the time it gets up into northern Pennsylvania, it's really the Marcellus Shale. Same, but we have no gas in ours. It's too close to the surface. So I've always been kind of a frustrated farmer. And when I did farm full time, I wasn't very good at it. I have a lot of funny stories where I'm the butt of all the the jokes, so to speak. But years ago, I was reading in one of the agricultural magazines, and it said that in order to increase organic matter in your soil, the best way to do it was continuous corn. And I said, well, that's wrong. And I just went to read some other article. And maybe about a year later, I came across another article stating the same thing. So I started to look into it. And well, what they mean, if you're no-tilling corn continuously. Now, as an aside, most of you have probably seen the U.S. Department of Agricultural maps with soil class 1, soil class 2, etc. The class 1 or class A soils, all that means that these are soils that you can grow continuous corn on with an acceptable rate of soil erosion. So they tend to be level soils. I always thought this rather odd in that in our area, some of your highest value crops maybe do better on sloping soils where you have air drainage for orchard crops or grapes, something of that nature. On my particular farms, probably the average slope is about 10–12%. So the Burke C soils are the dominant soil. On the top of the hills, we may have some little flatter ground, and on the toe slopes, we have a clay or wet ground, which has limitations for growing switchgrass. The idea of corn being the best way to increase organic matter, which in a lot of ways is your long-term key to soil fertility. It takes about 5 years of duff on the top of the soil before the lowest parts start breaking down by microorganisms and earthworms, and then you get your new stover on top, and the organisms are eating off the bottom, and you start getting that cycle working. So it really doesn't, you don't want to no-till 2 years and then say, I'm going to minimum tillage and go do soybeans. Switchgrass, doesn't increase organic matter as rapidly. However, the economics of the two crops, corn, I've asked a number of our cash grain guys locally what it costs them to plant an acre of corn. I'm going to ballpark it at about $600 an acre annually, and that's all in. That's amortizing equipment. It's everything. So it's a gamble. In our particular soils, which tend to be shallow and tend toward droughtiness, we have average yields about 160 bushels an acre, and you can get a severe drought impact every 7 to 10 years. Or if you get a severe heat wave during pollination. It'll knock your yield down. Switchgrass, on the other hand, since we only have to plant it one time, and I figure my experience is between $200 and $300 per acre to get it established. It really does pay to spend extra money on seed, because from my experience, anecdotally anyway, is that the yields are probably greatly impacted by the variety you choose rather than fertility levels or anything else you might do. So you're going to spend $200 to $300 an acre establishing the switchgrass and get no crop the first year. I think one time I got a very light crop. It was about a ton an acre on the second year, and you begin to get economic results on the third year. But the yields continue to climb to fourth, fifth, sixth years. And we try to allocate some money every year per acre to a cultural practice. It might be a broadleaf herbicide. We've been using, our fertilization has been poultry litter at the rate of a ton an acre. And since we're not putting a lot of acidic fertilizers on, we don't need a whole lot of lime. Plus the switchgrass is very tolerant of a wide range of pH, but we'll be putting on periodically a ton to the acre of calcium, high calcium limestone. So in our soils, if the guys average about 160 bushels, they really need about $4 corn to do well on that. On the switchgrass, I've been averaging, I want to say, about 2.9 tons to the acre. Last year, every year we've had an increased yield. We had 182 tons harvested last year. I use a custom farmer to harvest. We harvest once. We do it in December or January or even February or March, depending on the weather. And it's fairly efficient. It's one pass across the field, hopefully on frozen ground with the harvester. We don't have to rake it, and then it goes across with the baler, and the rest is trucking it out to his sheds. We've had 3 different markets over the years. We've had selling to for fuel. We have a friend who has a greenhouse over in New Jersey, has a high-tech European boiler, takes the big square bales of switchgrass, and each ton replaces 80 plus gallons of number 2 heating oil. But he's limited to what he can economically pay for the material. Last time I sold them, it was about $80 a ton at the farm gate. We've sold quite a bit for bedding down in Lancaster County. We've done that when it's been a little too weedy for the sock people. We've averaged about $120 a ton on those sales. And but the sock market is the premium market right now. It runs between $150, $160 a ton to farm gate. So I figure my worst case, even after paying the custom harvester, cost me about $60 a ton, cultural practices, taxes, etc. I'm still doing between 3 and 4 times better economically than if I was just renting out the ground to farmers doing cash grains. Plus, I get the additional benefits of the benefits to the soil long term. Now, we all know this switchgrass, it's very deep rooted, has the potential, the roots, to go down about 11 feet. That's deeper than our soils tend to be here in the Burke series. On average, we probably have about 6 foot of soil. and I've often wondered if some of the deeper roots might not penetrate what we call rippable shale, the area under the real soil. So even though it's very deep rooted, if the research I've been able to find on the internet, most of the root mass is in the upper 2 to 3 feet of soil. It's a C4 grass. Fancy way of saying that as a warm season grass, it uses about 1/2 the amount of water per ton of biomass that the European cool season grasses would use. Anecdotally, it seems to me, and I'm just curious, I have no data, it seems to me we're maybe increasing the amount of water that on the toe slopes, maybe making our wetter soils maybe a little wetter by growing switchgrass on the higher soils. I'm not sure. Our soils are subject to periodic drought. We haven't had one in a while, but every 7 to 10 years we might expect, you know, a very dry year. I'm not saying the switchgrass is drought proof, but it's certainly drought resistant. Just from your spring rains, you're going to get a crop. Another interesting factor with switchgrass is the senescence, which is the nutrients, not all of them, but 50% say, translocate after frost into the crown and or I should say the roots and the lower part of the stubble. So we try to leave about 6 inches of stubble, partly to preserve nutrients, but also to minimize the number of flat tires we get. If you cut it short, and particularly on the older plants, you can have, it's almost like a pencil stub sticking up, and you can puncture not a big form tire, but the lighter tires, where if you have about a 6-inch stubble, it seems to roll over. The tires roll it down, so less of a problem. That, of course, you get that senescence, that translocation of nutrients after killing frost. We only use 2 passes across the field. My custom farm is highly industrial, and he comes in and it does the whole farm in a couple, 3 days. But some will lay it down and let the weather leach it for a couple of days. That will leach more of the nutrients out of the crop. Various studies show it's spotty. You know, like some studies have shown not much increase in organic matter, particularly over the short term. But on balance, they show an increase of organic matter in the soil, or carbon sequestration, over time. I get a little more detail on that further into the presentation. I always thought that the source of organic matter from switchgrass was a combination of the feeder roots sloughing off at the end of every season, plus the fluorescence and the leaf shatter and things like that left on top of the ground. And that is a factor. But perhaps the biggest factor, kind of new to me this last year, is the exudates in the rhizosphere. And I wasn't even aware there was such a thing as a rhizosphere. And it's almost a microscopic area around the roots. And the plant, the switchgrass athlete, takes some of the carbon that it takes from the atmosphere and exudes it into the soil. And the rhizosphere is highly biologically active for for microbacteria, for fungi, mycelium, all that kind of stuff. But that's how a lot of the carbon is transferred from the atmosphere to the soil. It's not so much dead parts of the plant, but the plant kind of almost pushes it out of the root system. Interestingly, University of Auburn in Alabama, and this is relatively new, 2015, 2018, they've identified from switchgrass fields, switchgrass plants, a bacteria that's free living in the soil that actually fixes atmospheric nitrogen. So, you know, we're all aware of nodulars in like the legumes, and, you know, where you have to, you know, there's like nodules that the bacteria live in will fix nitrogen. I had no idea there were free living bacteria that could fix nitrogen, but there are some apparently associated with switchgrass. I haven't heard anything. I can't find any data on a commercialized product, but that's something I'd be very interested in. Most of the research indicates that switchgrass responds positively to maybe 50, 60 pounds of nitrogen per year. The ton an acre of poultry litter that we'll put on by analysis that has maybe 47 towards 50 pounds of nitrogen per ton. So, I'm really interested in learning more about this free living bacteria. There's quite a bit of information online on, you can get online the abstracts of various publications that are in the various biological agricultural journals, but you have to subscribe to the journals in order to read the entire article. University of Tennessee, they have done some switchgrass. Their research seems to indicate that switchgrass sequesters soil organic carbon at somewhat deeper depths, down the 2-3 foot level, rather than at the very top layer of soil. Eastern Nebraska finished a 9-year study, and they found that over 9 years, there was an increase in microbial biomass. And more researchers are finding the key to soil fertility is tied in with the soil microorganisms. Better aggregate stability. This has to do with porosity, and it'll allow rainwater to percolate better into the soil, give more air spaces in the soil. It's a factor towards fertility also. And a decrease, they're finding in soils with 9 years of switchgrass, a decrease of bulk density. And this basically has to do with compaction. Again, with your normal agricultural crops, you're plowing, you're disking, you're harrowing, you're doing a lot of crops over the field. You tend to get a plow layer, a hard pack layer, maybe at the plow level length. One of the things that allows switchgrass to increase your fertility is over the longer term. Every time you plow up soil, you're oxidizing organic matter. There was about 20 years ago, I took the family to Netherlands, where my wife is from. We visited some of her family and toured the country. Anyone interested in land use, in soils, it's one of the more fascinating places in the world. They know the land use history of their various places there, almost everywhere back to the 12th century, and some places back even to the 8th century. And of course, the Dutch hydraulic engineers rightfully are world famous. They did a drainage project in Great Britain, and at the time they did it, it's a peat bog basically, and they sunk a pole down, and just by draining it, and every year they'd mark it, or every couple of years, how much the soil had subsided just due to the oxidation of the organic matter in the peat. And over 150 years, it was like, I don't know, 11 feet of subsistence. Over a lifetime, you would hardly notice it, but so again, by having a perennial crop on the ground, if nothing else, helps build organic matter, and and I've always been of the belief, rightfully or wrongfully, that a high organic matter in the soil is probably your number one key to soil fertility. So that's what I have for you today.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Will.
How many acres are you farming?
We have close to 90 acres planted now in switchgrass. There's maybe 25 acres of that are relatively new plantings that have not really come into full production yet. So you're running shy of 3 ton an acre, correct? I'm running just shy of 3 ton an acre. One of the earliest fields we planted, the first one actually, and I had no idea what I was doing. I kind of still don't, but Ari Van Vudt had, trying to think, his over in Alamucci, New Jersey, has a greenhouse operation. And he put in a multi-fuel plant to heat the greenhouse. They have a big greenhouse, about 8 acres. And he had a field day, or an open house for potential growers of switchgrass. So I went over. I wasn't the farmer I had was a dairy farmer, bringing manure back, and I could just, like we were building fertility, even though the land rents weren't very much, it was good cultural practices. He was getting rid of his cows. He was switching into cash grain, and I didn't, so I'm looking around for alternatives. So we went over to the open house. And that's when we decided that we did a 5.5 acre planting. And the first year there was nothing there. And I'm like, oh, they're already laughing at me. And this field was very visible from the road. And I'm saying, oh, and the second year, there's still, hardly anything there. And I almost would said, oh, I just ought to plow it under and let them plant corn. But we let it go one more year. And the third year, we had really a drought, and switchgrass came on great. And of course, for the first couple of years, we had no market for it. We harvested, but had no place to sell it. Now, that first field was a combination of switchgrass, I believe it was cave and rock, Indian grass, I forget, somewhere in my notes I have the variety, and big and little blue stem. And a couple of years ago, about 3 years ago, we hit it with some 2,4-D because it was getting a little weedy. Now, I've never got any more than about 2 tons per acre out of this field. We hit it with 2,4-D, hit it with a ton of poultry fertilizer two years ago. It seemed to invigorate the Indian grass, came back really strong. There's some switchgrass in it, some big blue stem, some little blue stem. And last year, I don't have an exact breakdown of what I figured the tonnage was, but it wasn't much, maybe 2.2 tons the acre on that field. So I'm thinking that, you're not going to get the same yield with Indian grass you're going to get with switchgrass. Cave and rock, our more recent varietal picks to plant have been like Timber and Bowmaster from Ernst Seeds. So I think some of our better strips are probably yielding 4 ton or better. And some of the fields, although the crop might be very vigorous, I have patches where it just didn't take well, and it takes years to kind of close in those gaps. So, so that's, so I figure about 2.9 tons on a kind of average. That's conservatively stated.
Right. And you sold the majority of your crop this year to MKB?
Yes, the last 2 years.
Last 2 years.
And they've been really good to work with. Dan's been great.
Yes, he has.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Any other questions?
Great,
Hey,
Glenn.
it's a
Thanks.
wrap. Up, all right. Do you
Yeah,
have a
no,
question, Tom?
it's great. It's great to hear the sort of trajectory that you're on. And yeah, I guess any other sort of guidance you'd give? I mean, I think waiting was a good bit of guidance you learned from that slow establishment.
Yeah, I had several years ago, 5 or 6 probably, I had a game commission biologist come up to the farm to just for whatever reason. And I mentioned I had some switchgrass growing over at the other place. And he said, oh, I'd like to see it. And so I took him over, and I wasn't completely happy with it because, oh, it looks pretty good. And I was telling him of, basically what I just told you. And what he told me is that there are 3 things you need to grow switchgrass: patience, patience, and patience. And it is really a very forgiving crop. I'd like to use as few and as little chemicals as possible, but a broadleaf weed killer is certainly very helpful. In an established switchgrass or warm season grass field. The other thing, of course, is to mix up your varieties. It's good not to have a strict monoculture. It can be all switchgrass, but you at least want different varieties, and make sure that the parental lines, as you are, aren't too similar.
Any signs of rust in any of your fields?
I'm sorry?
Any signs of rust in any of the fields?
Yeah, I've seen some, but it doesn't seem to be real severe. So, and I have, well, in that first field I mentioned, Cave and Rock, I certainly in there. But maybe that's one reason that the Indian grass is so vigorous. That doesn't affect the Indian grass.
That's what we're experiencing on the farm here in WAP. The big blue stem is taking over on the ridge field.
Great, yeah.
And the switchgrass is about this tall.
Huh. Yeah, I bought some foliar spray micronutrients last year, and I haven't got them on yet. But I want to be applying some micronutrient material, some liquid fertilizer material that Tegens, who was the founder of Growers Fertilizers they're out in Ohio now, and he had a book, More Food Through Better Soil Science. I think that was what it's called. I had a friend back in New Jersey who was in sales for Growers Fertilizer. In fact, a funny story, I think, there was a piece of ground he was farming of mine, and he told me that the lady next door called him up all upset because he'd had, I don't know whether it was a plane or helicopter came over to spray the material in the field, and she was all beside herself. So he said, I calmed her down. He said, lady, I have good news and bad news for you. He said, this stuff is, he said, you can drink this stuff and won't hurt you. That's the good news. He said, the bad news, not enough drifted over to your place to do you any good. But Tegens was one of the pioneers in foliar fertilizer, and he couldn't get grants because this is back in the 50s. He was Rutgers University, and before that, University of Massachusetts, did a lot of work on greenhouse tomatoes. And he was getting very good results with really small amounts of total nutrients, but foliar applied. And of course, most of the research for this type of thing came from the fertilizer industry, and his research money dried up. But I went to one of the one of the growers meetings, and you would have thought they were selling calcium limestone as opposed to fertilizer. So he was big on balancing the caution exchange ratio in the soil between total, and then the ratio between calcium and magnesium. When I was in high school, I wish I had paid more attention to chemistry class, and I never took organic chemistry because, but that's the type of background you need anymore to really fully understand this stuff. So I tend to be more anecdotal.
Have you ever attempted to interseed the newer strains into your older strains?
No, I have interseeded. I had a couple years ago. I had a planting there was switchgrass there, but it's just horrible. And so the following spring, what we did is we hit it with Roundup, and the switchgrass was just beginning to bud out, but it's pretty tough and not enough material got on the switchgrass to kill it, but it knocked down the foxtail and anything else that was green. And then we went in and we reseeded on top of it, which probably better varieties, a year later, year smarter kind of thing. That field worked those fields came on really well. Our most recent seeding, which was 3 years ago, two of the 4 fields just looked horrible. We hit them this year with 2,4-D, broadleaf herbicide, and I was going to reseed on top of them, but it was getting a little late with the COVID. I thought I'd just save my money and see what, make a science experiment. So I didn't reseed, and the fields responded really well. So I suspect when you do see, and these fields were seeded with better, they were Bowmaster and Timber in both of these. So I think a lot of the seed that you plant this year, it may be dormant until next year. And or the natural seed drop that even from that first year that, so it's, so, maybe if looking at the fields, I'm pretty pleased with them. Had I spent a couple $1,000s on new seed to overseed it, I think I basically would have been wasting my money. So, so it's a switchgrass, pretty forgiving crop, which makes it well suited to the likes of me.
Anybody have anything else? Matt, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for the information.
Well, a pleasure. I look forward to seeing myself on on the website.
On YouTube, yeah, for sure. A plug for next week. We're doing our annual association meeting with minutes and treasurer's report and new business and old business and all that good stuff. Hope you can join us. Thanks.
Sure
everybody.
will. Tom, Joe, Kyle.
Yes.
Good seeing you guys. Take care.
Talk to you. Bye.
I'll give you a call
Bye,
next
everyone.
week, Will.
Okay, Joe, good.
Okay, I'm exiting out, I think. Okay.